Ladies and gentlemen, can I ask you, please, to take your seats so we can begin? Please take your seats. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, I would be grateful if you take a few moments to listen to the following short safety announcement. On hearing the fire alarm, we would ask everyone to evacuate the building immediately. Please leave in a calm and orderly manner using the exits which are located at the front and the rear of the hall. Then make your way to the assembly point at the front of the physics building located at the car park side of the hall, which is opposite the main building. We would ask you to remain there until instructed otherwise. Please do not attempt to re-enter the building, even if the alarms have been silenced, as this does not always mean the emergency is over. I would also like to take this opportunity to ask you to silence all mobile phones now. Thank you.
I'm pleased to announce that the two governments and the political parties of Northern Ireland have reached agreement.
Even now, this will not work unless in your will and in your mind you make it work.
It's a day we should treasure, a day when agreement and accommodation have taken the place of difference and division.
In the days to come, there may be those who will try to undermine this great achievement, not only with words, but perhaps also with violence.
I'm very happy for people in Northern Ireland. A lot of people have talked about a new beginning. I hope and believe it will be. I'm sure the positive news of today will continue to be built on.
I look forward to the future. I see a great opportunity there for us to start a healing process here in Northern Ireland.
It's only on the basis of equality, fairness and respect for our differences that we can begin to heal the deep divisions between our people.
These negotiations and the new arrangements are part of our collective journey from the failures of the past towards a future together as equals.
I am convinced that we have taken a step today of which we can be proud. We are giving something to the future.
It's about recognising the need to encompass all attitudes and all opinions, all religions, all creeds, all colours, sexes, disabilities, within a diverse and honourable society.
We have interrupted the culture of failure in Northern Ireland. There is no going back.
Yes, 71.12%.
First Minister in Northern Ireland and First Deputy First Minister in Northern Ireland.
Please welcome to the stage your host for today, Andrea Catherwood.
A very good morning, everybody, and a warm welcome to the Sir William Whitla Hall at Queen's University Belfast for the first day of Agreement 25, the Dynamics of Peace. Today's a really special day as we join together to mark 25 years since the signing of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. I'm Andrea Catherwood, and I'm going to be your host to guide you through today's events. I'm a broadcaster for BBC Radio 4 based in London, and like a number of reporters from Northern Ireland, I left and I went on to become a foreign correspondent and live and work around the world. But I learned my trade here in Belfast. In fact, the first documentary I ever made was for BBC Radio 4 called Coming of Age. It was the 18th anniversary of the start of the Troubles, and I was 18 years old. The point of the documentary was to ask what was it like to grow up and reach adulthood having never known peace. So I interviewed other 18-year-olds about their experiences. You can probably imagine some of the events that shaped those young lives and our fears for the future. I can't tell you how heartening it is to have seen recent media coverage about those born not like me when the Troubles started, but when they ended. When the Good Friday Agreement was signed, those peace babies, those who have never grown up knowing the kind of violence that we lived through. Perfect? Absolutely not. Transformational? Yes. And that agreement, of course, would not have been possible without many of the distinguished guests and inspiring speakers that we're going to hear from today. In a moment, I'm going to invite our first speakers to come on stage. And in this opening session, we're going to hear from President and Vice-Chancellor of Queen's University, Professor Ian Greer. Hilary Rodham Clinton, Chancellor of Queen's University Belfast, Emma Murphy, President of Queen's Students' Union, and Senator George J. Mitchell with his wife Heather. So please join me in welcoming our first speakers to the stage. Well, I'd like to invite President and Vice-Chancellor of Queen's University, Professor Ian Greer, to officially open the conference. Ian.
Distinguished guests, colleagues, friends, I offer you a very warm welcome to Queen's University this morning, and today, the first day of our conference, Agreement 25. It's good that we're here together to mark that occasion. Each day, the Agreement 25 conference has a theme, and the theme today is Reflect. So I'm really delighted that we have so many distinguished guests, speakers and panellists visiting the university, contributors who can speak with the authority born from making the agreement a reality. We'll reflect not only on the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, but also on the peace and prosperity of the last 25 years. With today's theme of reflection, we think on the huge milestone that was reached when the Belfast Good Friday Agreement was signed. A critically important milestone on a journey, but as many have said, it's not our final destination. Rather, the agreement is a set of tools that can help us overcome the challenges on our path. Sadly, there are still some events that emphasise the fact that we remain on that journey. Events that bring us right back to those painful memories of the past, notably the recent attempt on the life of Detective Chief Inspector John Caldwell. The solidarity shown by our Northern Ireland politicians following that event sent an important signal. Strong confirmation of their commitment to a peaceful future, peace that will bring prosperity. That reflection reminds me of the words of one of our greatest alumni, Seamus Heaney. Hope is not optimism which expects things to turn out well, but something rooted in the conviction that there is good worth doing. As we reflect on the last 25 years, we can see that good. It's become the reality of our everyday life in Northern Ireland. That good came from the hard work of many leaders. Leaders who were central either to creating the agreement or to delivering the lasting impact over 25 years. Without their vision, their conviction, their tenacity and indeed their bravery, it simply would not have happened. We will hear much about them and their achievements over the course of today, and there are too many to mention individually in a short speech, but it would be remiss not to call out the leadership of Senator George Mitchell, our former Chancellor. And we're delighted that Senator Mitchell And we're really delighted, of course, that Senator Mitchell is with us in person for this event. We're also proud that Queen's is an anchor institution for Northern Ireland, and we're part of that journey. Queen's is a place that transforms lives. It transforms lives through education, through innovation that drives economic growth, and importantly, as a forum to share different views, to challenge them and to respectfully debate, and in doing so, to come together. The conference epitomises that role for our university. By working together, we can change the lives of young people. At Queen's, we believe that it's a student's ability, potential and commitment to learning that comes first, not their personal or social circumstances. Our Pathway Opportunity programme really does make a difference. It has reached into disadvantaged communities across Northern Ireland and helped support over 800 students transition to higher education. Our inclusive approach also extends to community-based projects, such as in the markets of the Greater Shankill, because we believe that partnership is key to the success of an inclusive society. So over the next 3 days, we'll reflect on the past and renew our commitment to collaboration, our commitment to partnership, our commitment to peace. And we'll reimagine the future as we journey from the history of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement to our hope for the future. In the words of Seamus Heaney, over these 3 days we will see hope and history rhyme. Now, the focus of any university is, of course, our students. They're our future. And over the past year, it's been a great privilege for me to work with an outstanding president of our Students' Union. So it's with great pleasure that I hand you over now to Emma Murphy, President of the Queen's University Students' Union.
Ladies and gentlemen, honoured guests and friends, I'm absolutely privileged to be speaking to you on this celebration for the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement. This conference is rightly being hosted by Queen's University, as I know that for so many from here, university is a chance to meet people from different backgrounds. Whether it's in the classroom or over a pint or two in the Students' Union, it's still many people's first chance to experience true integrated education. Today, I want to specifically pay homage to the contributions that the student movement has made to the peace process. For decades, students have been at the forefront of advocacy and activism through peaceful protest, rallies, and calling for the end of violence. In 1972, the forming of the National Student Union in Northern Ireland, NUS-USI, was one of the first institutions to work across the UK and Ireland, and has been regarded by many as the blueprint for the Good Friday Agreement in how it has collectively brought students together as a force for good against sectarianism. From civil rights to participating in the Yes campaign for the 1998 referendum, the student movement has been key at putting pressure on political parties to get in the room with each other and has shown the importance of standing up for what you believe in. The student movement today is still integral to creating change and challenging the status quo. As president of the Students' Union, young people that I speak to have no doubt in their mind about peace. For us, there is no going back. Instead, their minds are focused on the issues of today, the cost of living crisis, housing, climate change, job opportunities. There is no doubt that the past quarter of a century, has improved conditions here, but there's still much further to go. In 2023, we should not be living in damp houses, relying on food banks, or being forced to work long hours. Young people should not be disenfranchised by politics here and reluctant to get involved. I myself am a peace baby. At 23 years old, I've been born and raised in Belfast my whole life. For me, so much of the Troubles has been a ghost story, to steal the quote from Derry Girls. Instead of going through violence myself, I've grown up hearing from my dad about the violence and intimidation he suffered through in rural Dromore and the relief he felt every single night closing up his dad's bar. I've heard from my mum questions of why on earth she moved to Belfast from Dublin in the 90s when there was a shooting in the area on the first night that she moved up here. Just to say they are both fine now and in the audience doing well. To so many in the room, activists, elected representatives, people working in communities, I'm forever indebted to you. Thank you. Conferences and historical moments like these are a golden opportunity, not only to reflect on the past, but to build for the future. The Good Friday Agreement required difficult conversations and brave leadership, and that is exactly what is needed again. Without a functioning government, the lack of decision-making is failing future generations instead of building upon the developments that Northern Ireland has made. Let this anniversary be the impetus for action against stagnation and towards progress. Let the lesson be that change is not one moment or one group of people. Let us keep moving forward. I will now invite our Chancellor, Hillary Rodham Clinton, to speak. As one of the most recognised female politicians in the world, her role in peace building in Northern Ireland was integral by not only championing the work of the Women's Coalition, but by going into local working class communities and speaking to women there and building peace. Thank you so much.
Welcome. Welcome to Queen's University Agreement 25 Conference. And thank you, Emma, for those important words and for representing the students, the 25,000 students of Queen's at this historic gathering. Because it's so appropriate since this is truly about the futures of the young people of Northern Ireland, who are the true subjects of our gathering today. Thank you, Vice-Chancellor Greer, for your visionary leadership of the university, and a special thank you to George Mitchell, an esteemed former Chancellor of Queen's, as well as a colleague and friend. America and Northern Ireland were well served throughout the long public service of George Mitchell and the long road to peace under his capable leadership. He rightfully earned not only the respect, but also the trust of participants on all sides. I was pleased to work with him at the State Department, and I am so delighted he will share his reflections with you today. It is also an honor to be joined by so many important participants of the Good Friday Agreement and its aftermath, who you will hear from over the next 3 days. The Lord Mayor of Belfast, Tony Blair, Bertie Ahern, Bill Clinton, all of whom will be speaking. The conference co-chairs, Ryan Feeney and Professor Richard English, as well as distinguished faculty of this university, students, alumni, and guests from around the world. On the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement, I think we can all agree to celebrate a significant milestone with both a sense of accomplishment, but also of hope and determination that the next 25 years will bring more fully the peace, prosperity, and safety the agreement promised. Now, there can be no doubt that people in Northern Ireland today enjoy safety and security much more than those who had lived through the previous decades that they could have only dreamed of. And the longevity of the Good Friday Agreement remains a true triumph of diplomacy and a testament to democracy's power to transcend divisions and deliver peace. But it is primarily a testament to a lot of tough, determined, everyday people who refused to go back to the days of division and violence. This first day of the conference is titled Reflect, as we hear from the architects of the 1998 Belfast Agreement. Tomorrow is titled Renew, as we discuss what should be done to fulfill the promise of the agreement. And day 3 is to reimagine the economic prospects for Northern Ireland, especially in light of the Windsor Agreement framework. So you will hear from the architects soon, but first, let me just make a few points about what we are celebrating and about the work that remains. I think all of us know how difficult it was to secure the Good Friday Agreement, how much work and sacrifice it took on all sides to bring about peace, and how much effort has gone into implementing its tenets and building a new government in Northern Ireland. The credit for peace ultimately goes to the brave people of Northern Ireland, who took risks for peace. I well remember Bill's and my first trip here in 1995, the first time a sitting United States president visited Northern Ireland. And after the Christmas tree lighting ceremony in front of Belfast City Hall, in the midst of that enormous crowd where so many of the people gathered were holding the hands of their children or holding smaller children on their shoulders, we gathered right here in Whitla Hall. Catholic leadership stood on one side of the room, Protestants stood on the other. It was not easy for them to reach across that literal, physical divide. It took years of building trust, and it took courage. Bill and I moved back and forth between them, meeting and talking with them. We understood then that making peace and making peace endure would require patience and follow-through, and would take time. I remember also on a visit in 2009 when I was Secretary of State, talking with Martin McGuinness and Peter Robinson as they worked through thorny challenges of governing together. That took courage too. And of course, there wouldn't be a Good Friday Agreement to celebrate today if it were not for the women of Northern Ireland. I well remember starting in 1995, meeting with Protestant and Catholic women, mothers and daughters, sisters, aunts, friends who may have attended different churches on Sunday, but 7 days a week prayed that their husbands and their sons, their friends, would come back and forth from work, from shopping peacefully, prayed for a better future for their children and grandchildren. Women like the late Mo Molam, Inez McCormick, Pat Hume, determined, unstoppable forces for peace. And Joyce McCartan, who brought together Protestant and Catholic women in a safe house where they realized they all wanted the same things: good jobs, good schools, peaceful, secure neighborhoods, streets you could walk safely down, security and prosperity you could count on to build a life and human rights. Women like Brona Hines, Monica McWilliams, Jane Morris, and Pearl Sager, who formed their own political party in 1996 in order to participate in the formal peace negotiations. A quarter century of bloodshed and strife and millennia of embedded sexism had discouraged most women from being in politics, from being in the arena, but not them. One of the goals of this conference is to recognize the role that women played and are playing in peace building. And we're also here to amplify the voices of the next generation of leaders and to create a dialogue to address the major issues impacting society today so we can keep building on the current peace over the next 25 years. Because while the Good Friday Agreement is an enormous achievement, we know that peace, prosperity, and progress that so many have worked tirelessly to achieve remains incomplete. The work of integration in housing and schools is far from finished. Neighborhoods remain divided. Poverty and unemployment persist. The difficulties of the past continue to threaten the present. You know we are at a standstill with the Northern Ireland Assembly no longer functioning. But the Windsor Agreement provides a path forward, not just for convening, but for positioning Northern Ireland as an economic hub for global trade and investment through privileged access to the UK and all of its trading partners, as well as the EU. Now, there have been many moments in Northern Ireland's peace journey where progress seemed difficult, when every route forward looked blocked. There seemed nowhere to go. But you have always found a way through, and I believe you will again, because the stakes for the people of Northern Ireland are so high. You stand as an example to the world of how even the staunchest adversaries can overcome differences to work together for the common and greater good. So I encourage everyone now to move forward with the same spirit of unstoppable grit and resolve that brought the peace 25 years ago. Your friends in the United States will be behind you all the way as you work toward peace, prosperity, and stability that lasts. So that is what we are here to discuss over the next 3 days. This forum will provide a chance for leaders who created the agreement and those working to extend it and realize its full promise to share their experiences and visions for the future. What I find so remarkable about being here at Queen's is that many of the 25,000 students were born after the Good Friday Agreement was signed. Yet they study together in Maclay Library. They play sports and join clubs together. They have those long, deep conversations you have at university late into the night. The ordinary activities of students all over the world. But when considered in the context of Northern Ireland's history, the idea of young people from all communities, unionists and nationalists, Republicans and loyalists, becoming one another's friends, classmates, and mentors, it's clear there's nothing ordinary at all about what has been built here at Queen's. And what an example and model it sets for not just Northern Ireland, but the rest of us. Because Queen's mission is transformation of knowledge and learning of individuals and societies, of leaving its mark on history and the world, Consider the motto of both the university and Belfast, taking from Psalms 116. What shall we give in return for so much? The answer has been clear from the beginning: as much as we can. And one of the driving reasons to resume the government, to get about the business of governing, is that right now 33% of school leavers in Northern Ireland leave to seek their futures elsewhere, taking with them their skills, their education, their ambitions, their dreams. The ongoing struggle to finish the Good Friday Agreement and claim its full promise is a reminder of one of the things I try to remember in my life when I've been really high or really low. There are no final victories or defeats in life. The most important thing is to fight the right fight and to keep doing it the best you can for as long as you can. I want to leave you with one final story. 3 years after my first visit to Northern Ireland, I helped organize the Vital Voices Conference of Women in Belfast at the new International Conference Centre. Women who were coming together in public to find solutions to the conflict, to contribute to a lasting peace. As I spoke from the podium, I looked up and I saw the leaders of Sinn Féin sitting in the front row of the balcony. And right behind them, I saw the leaders of the DUP. At the time, the parties and the individuals were not speaking to each other. But the fact that they were both in the same room at a women's conference for peace exemplified their openness to listening, to compromising, to agreeing on a better future for the place they all cherished. We cannot take the progress we've seen for granted. It's what a 15-year-old boy named Mark Lennox from Glengormley High School wrote in a letter to my husband in 1995. He wrote, "If Northern Ireland is to have a future, then we must all work hard for peace and make a real effort. We will have to change our ideas and work for change." That is the choice the people of Northern Ireland made in 1998, and it is the choice I hope you will continue to make. This 25th anniversary is the opportunity so many generations have worked toward and waited for, to give the people of Northern Ireland the future they deserve, especially for their children and grandchildren. So let's get to work to see that men and women join together to make the world, as well as Northern Ireland, better for the next 25 years and 25 after that. Godspeed.
Thank you. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here to witness this historic anniversary. May it be the first of many. Thank you for your very warm reception. It's a great honor and a pleasure for me and my wife Heather to be here with you today. I'm especially grateful to the Chancellor and the Vice-Chancellor and his staff here at Queen's University. They've worked long and hard to organize this week's events. They've welcomed all of us, the citizens of Northern Ireland, teachers, school children, media, politicians, all of us with extraordinary warmth and hospitality. Thank you, Hillary and Ian, for what you've done in organizing this conference. 25 years ago, the people of Northern Ireland and their leaders changed the course of history. It was a day when history opened itself to hope. The people of Northern Ireland supported, worked for, and established a democratic, peaceful process as their preferred form of governance. They overwhelmingly rejected political violence as a way to resolve their differences. If history teaches us anything, it is that history itself is never finished. On the evening the agreement was reached, I commended the men and women who wrote and signed it. But I also said that it would take other leaders in the future to safeguard and extend their work. And so it has. I am here with many others to sound that bell one more time. Life is change for every human being, for every family, for every government, for every society. All human beings, every single one of us, is fallible, as are all human organizations and institutions. And in human affairs, the answer to every problem contains within it the seeds of a new problem. Today, a quarter century after the agreement, the people of Northern Ireland continue to wrestle with their doubts, their differences, their disagreements. This, of course, is only natural, and they will continue to do so no matter how successful their political leaders are. The answer is not perfection or permanence. It is now, as it was then, for the current and future leaders of Northern Ireland to act with courage and vision, as their predecessors did 25 years ago, to find workable answers to the daily problems of the present, to preserve peace, to leave to the next generation peace, freedom, opportunity, and the hope of a better future for their children. One of the strengths of democracy is the right of all citizens to publicly disagree with and to criticize their government officials and their policies. But all values, when carried to extremes, can become vices. So if there's one bit of unsolicited advice I'd like to give to the people of Northern Ireland, it's this: don't always be so hard on yourselves. At the same time, never, ever give up on the belief that we all can do better and be better. The future becomes the present in a heartbeat. 6 years ago, I made one of my many visits to Northern Ireland. The United Kingdom was wrestling with Brexit, and in the United States, we had just elected President Trump. While I was here, I was asked several times essentially the same question: can you comment on how terrible and upsetting the politics are here in Northern Ireland? So much anger, so much disagreement, so much distrust. In reply, I said, well, I can't speak for the UK, but I've just come from the United States, and I don't think any American is in a position to lecture others on their disagreements. I spoke those words 6 years ago, and they're even more relevant today. I do acknowledge, with a nod to the great sense of humor that often accompanies it, that people in Northern Ireland are quick to take offense. I was made aware of this quite dramatically in June of 1996 on the very first day of the all-party talks. In a large conference room filled with delegates from the two governments and 10 political parties, David Irvine, in a loud voice, shouted across the room to me. "Senator," he said, "if you are to be of any use to us, there is one thing you must understand." "What is it?" I asked. With a smile on his face, he replied, "We in Northern Ireland will drive 100 miles out of our way to receive an insult." Like you, I laughed, thinking it was a joke. But as I looked around the room, they weren't laughing. They were all nodding in agreement. Over the next few years, I witnessed firsthand the unique skill of Northern Ireland politicians in the art of insulting their opponents. But a wise person can always be superior to the insults he or she receives. Wisdom and courage and grace and even stubborn desire can help to sow peace and root it down deep in the soil where it can once again grow. So I say now to the current and future leaders of Northern Ireland, there is much in your history and in your politics that divides you, but there also is much that can bring you together, that can inspire you to continue what your predecessors began a quarter century ago. It is not a sign of weakness to resolve your differences by democratic and peaceful means. To the contrary, it is a sign of strength and of wisdom. And it clearly reflects the will of the overwhelming majority of the people of Northern Ireland. Yes, they often disagree, sometimes very strongly. Yes, they may take offense quickly. But it is unmistakably clear that the people of Northern Ireland do not want to return to violence, not now and not ever. I know that each of your parties, like all political parties in the world, have some of what I call the 100%ers. They want everything their way all the time. To them, any compromise is a sign of weakness. But I say to you that reasoned, principled compromise is essential, especially in divided societies, and it reflects a belief in democratic values, that we all are in this together. There is great depth in recognizing that the only way to help us emerge from the rubble of conflict is that we must learn to understand one another. We don't need to love one another. We don't even need to like one another, although we hope we could. But we must learn to understand one another and to be able to say yes to one another, especially when the quicker and easier answer is no. Because like it or not, we are all in this together. Facing the reality of the future rather than clinging to the myths of the past takes strength and courage and vision. Those we honor today showed those qualities a quarter of a century ago. they will be forever remembered, and others will be remembered as well. One grim but tangible memory is in these statistics. According to the Northern Ireland Police Service and the Northern Ireland Statistics Agency, from the start of the Troubles until 1998, over 3,500 people were killed and an estimated 50,000 were injured in sectarian violence. In the 25 years since the agreement was reached, there have been about 164 security-related deaths. But don't think of these just as numbers, because they are not. Think of them as mothers and fathers, sons and daughters, whose lives were cut short or permanently impaired. Still, to this day, their lives echo down through the years. And so I ask each and every person in this hall to stand and honor all of these lives, and every one was an individual human being. All of these lives with a moment of silence. Please stand. Thank you. Please be seated. There have been many architects in the House of Peace. It is impossible to name them all. They, of course, include President and Secretary Clinton. I'm very grateful to President Clinton for appointing me to serve as his representative in Northern Ireland and for his unswerving support for me and for the people of Northern Ireland during the long years of failure that followed until we got an agreement. Prime Ministers Blair and Ahern were absolutely indispensable to the process, as were other leaders of the UK and Irish governments. Many of their predecessors helped to lay the foundations for peace. They include Albert Reynolds and John Bruton in Ireland and John Major in the United Kingdom. Major and Bruton made the crucial decisions to establish the all-party talks and to invite the independent chairman to head that process. I shared that role with two extraordinary men, the late Harry Holkeri, the former Prime Minister of Finland, and General John de Chastelain, the former head of the Canadian Defence Forces. Each of us was well served by small but very able staffs. For me, they included Martha Pope, David Pozorski, and Kelly Curry. Both governments were represented by a succession of very able ministers and officials. They included from the UK Lord Patrick Mayhew, Sir Michael Ancram, Mo Mowlam, Lord Paul Murphy, Jonathan Powell, and Bill Jeffries. From Ireland, Dick Spring, David Andrews, Sean O'Higgin, Liz O'Donnell, David Cooney, Tim O'Connor, and David Donoghue. Special recognition must, of course, go to the leaders of the major Northern Ireland parties. John Hume led the Social Democratic and Labour Party, and David Trimble led the Ulster Unionist Party. Without John Hume, there would not have been a peace process. Without David Trimble, there would not have been a peace agreement. they were justly awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. Lord Trimble later served as the First Minister of the Northern Ireland government. In the UUP, he was greatly aided by several key officials, among them Lord Reg MP, Lord John Taylor, Lord Ken McGuinness, and Sir Geoffrey Donaldson. In the SDLP, John Hume received strong support from several talented leaders, including Seamus Mallon, a brilliant orator and negotiator who later became Deputy First Minister, and Mark Durkan, Brid Rogers, and Sean Farron. Gerry Adams and the late Martin McGuinness led Sinn Féin into and through the entire process. They were assisted by Jerry Kelly, Barbara de Bruyn, and Alex Maskey, who is now the Speaker of the Northern Ireland Assembly. They were all and always strong and effective advocates for their cause. Later, McGuinness served for several years as Deputy First Minister. Dr. Ian Paisley was a long-time and strong leader of the Democratic Unionist Party. The DUP withdrew from the talks and opposed the agreement, but they later re-entered the process at crucial talks in St. Andrews and thereafter participated actively in governance. Dr. Paisley served for several years as First Minister, where he and Martin McGuinness achieved some celebrity as the Chuckles brothers. Paisley was succeeded as DUP leader and First Minister by Peter Robinson, who had been a very effective negotiator while the DUP was in the talks. They, Paisley and Robinson, were ably assisted in the talks by Nigel Dodds and Ian Paisley, Jr. The Alliance Party was led by Dr. John Alderdice. He and his colleagues were very effective in the talks, and he later served with distinction as the first Speaker of the Northern Ireland Assembly. And his colleague, Eileen Bell, also later served in that same role. The Northern Ireland Women's Party, led by Monica McWilliams and Pearl Sager, played a vital role, as indeed did all of the women in all of the coalitions that stitched the threads of peace together. The Loyalist parties were small in number, but they played a very large role in the negotiations. Their leaders were David Irvine and Gary McMichael. Both were outstanding and powerful advocates for peace. They were assisted by other articulate leaders like Billy Hutchinson and Dawn Purvis. The Labour Party was effectively led by Malachy Curran. With the perspective of a quarter century, the strength of these leaders and the people they represented has become clear. Their places in history have been assured. I now know them all as friends. The only thing that gives me pause about reading this long list of honorees is that in the dust of my memory, I likely have inadvertently left out some who should have been included. And if so, I sincerely and profoundly apologize. So I'd like to now ask you to stand again to applaud these courageous men and women who brought peace to Northern Ireland with a sound that will ring out for years to come. The course of every true idea ends up eventually in the obvious. Peace is a true idea. It must belong to us all. It can be in some ways more difficult than war, but it must be pursued. It is our task, the task of our children and of their children, to ensure this peace so that history continues to open itself to hope. Speaking of children, in October of 1997, my wife Heather gave birth to our son Andrew. By then, I had been involved in Northern Ireland for nearly 3 years. The all-party talks had been going on for a year and a half, and there had been no meaningful progress. Actually, no progress of any kind. In many respects, the talks were about reciting and repeating history rather than changing it. The ceasefires were routinely violated. Some parties entered late, some left early. The anger, the hostility, the obstacles all seemed endless. Over and over again, I was asked, "Senator, since you have failed to get an agreement, when are you leaving Northern Ireland to go home?" Earlier that year, after an especially difficult period, Heather and I briefly discussed that question. I told her I wanted to stay, and she agreed. So I returned, and as I had always done, I answered that same question day after day, saying that while it was true that we hadn't gotten an agreement, I still felt it worthwhile to continue the effort to try to end the violence. But then our son, Andrew, was born. And as every parent knows, my life and my responsibilities would change irreversibly. I flew home for his birth, and I also made plans to travel to Washington to meet with President Clinton's National Security Advisor. My intention was to tell him that I was, for the first time, seriously considering leaving Northern Ireland, to ask for his reaction and advice, to request a meeting with the President to discuss the matter. I had continued my close relationship with President Clinton as he and Mrs. Clinton maintained a deep concern and an intense personal interest in Northern Ireland. My wife, Heather, had to remain in the hospital with Andrew for a few days. So it was there that we had a long and somber talk about the future. I had asked and was told that on the day of Andrew's birth, 61 children were born in Northern Ireland. We talked about what Andrew's life might be like and about the lives of the 61 children from Northern Ireland. Then I told Heather that I was going to Washington and why. Her reaction was immediate and strong. She said, "You have to go back until it ends, one way or the other. If you leave now when the fighting resumes and lots of people die, you'll never be able to forgive yourself. Go back, give it one last try. I'll take good care of Andrew. You think about those 61 children from Northern Ireland." So I canceled the trip to Washington and returned to Northern Ireland. And when I got back to Belfast, I felt like I was coming home. But coming home doesn't always mean returning to safety. Unfortunately, the situation continued to deteriorate. Just before Christmas of 1997, I met with the party leaders to try to get them to agree on a statement of the major issues to be resolved. Mind you, this was not trying to get agreement on the answers to any questions. It was, after a year and a half of discussion, just to get them to agree on the wording of the issues that were to be resolved. At first, the meeting was amicable and positive. Then suddenly, the mood turned intensely negative. The old resentments returned, the insults resumed, and the meeting broke up in anger and acrimony. For the first time, I felt a sense of defeat. Then it quickly got even worse. A few days later, just after Christmas, a prominent Loyalist paramilitary leader was killed while in prison. That touched off a round of retaliatory violence that threatened to end the talks and to plunge Northern Ireland back into the Troubles. The next series of meetings, some in London in January and in Dublin in February, were not in any sense negotiations. To the contrary, they became outlets for anger, for hostility, and the desire for revenge, as each side blamed the other for the escalating violence. Two parties were suspended from the talks. As we left Dublin, the mood was negative and the outlook bleak. So much effort seemed to be going down the drain of history. On the flight back to the U.S., my sense of defeat and despair deepened. And then I recalled Heather's words, "One last try." I took out a pad of paper and I wrote down the draft of a plan for a final intensive effort with an early, unbreakable deadline. I talked with my two colleagues, Prime Minister Holkry and General de Chastelain. They were in full agreement. When we returned to Belfast in March, we entered into discussions with the two governments and the 8 political parties still in the talks to get an agreement on an early, unbreakable deadline for an end to the talks, one way or the other. That discussion was long and difficult, but finally in late March we got agreement on 2 weeks of final negotiations and, crucially, an unbreakable deadline. My sense of despair gave way to a sense of hope for one important reason. We, the independent chairman, had no authority to impose a deadline. We could propose it as we had, but it required the approval of both governments and of each party. The fact that every party still in the talks agreed to the deadline meant to me that they were sincere in wanting an end to the conflict, despite their deep differences and the nearly 2 years of unproductive haggling they'd just been through. They still faced very difficult issues on which they had strongly conflicting views, but they did not want to return to the violence of the past. And the only way to do that was to reach an agreement. There was another reason for my hopes, personal to me and much less serious. I'd been involved in Northern Ireland for more than 3 years, but I still had a hard time understanding some of what was being said in the negotiations. I'd spent 15 years in the United States Senate, the last 6 as the Senate's leader. The debates were vigorous, but orderly, one speaker at a time. Here, especially in the early years, there was disorder. Delegates from 10 political parties hurled insults back and forth, shouted at and insulted each other, and some regularly and loudly stormed out in protest. I learned that the dramatic walkout is a major feature of political life in Northern Ireland. And the only thing that reminded me of the Senate was that some people spoke often and at very great length. It took a long time to establish an orderly process. Along the way, I made many mistakes. One of them was at the beginning of the talks, and it was in a naive and misguided effort on my part to be helpful. As a politician myself, I knew that all of them, politicians, liked to talk, and none of them liked to listen. So I foolishly said to them, if no one else will listen to you, I will be here. You will be heard. How I regretted that over the next... It wasn't weeks, it wasn't months, it was years that I listened to the same people saying the same thing over and over and over again. And many of them talked very fast with accents that I couldn't quite figure out. So to improve my understanding, I held many, many hundreds of informal meetings in my office and theirs where I said little and listened as much as possible. Listening, really listening to someone else speak, is hard, especially when it goes on for years. But it's also a sign of respect, and I respected them for what they were trying to do. By a fortunate coincidence, this effort began to pay off in the lengthy discussions to establish a deadline. So as we began the last 2 intensive weeks, I was encouraged by the fact that finally I could understand everything that was being said. More importantly, the long period of listening greatly helped me in the search for common ground. We set a deadline of midnight, Thursday, April 9. We didn't meet that deadline, and we also failed to meet the targets we had set for each of the 14 days of the final effort. My memory of those 2 weeks is a blur of constant activity as 2 governments, 8 political parties, and the independent chairman sought a written agreement on which all could agree on 3 complex and related relationships within Northern Ireland, between Northern Ireland, and between Ireland and the United Kingdom. My admiration grew for the men and women who struggled to find common ground against a history of distrust, disagreement, and violence, to the limits of their physical capacity and under enormous political pressure. On the last week, Prime Ministers Blair and Ahern came to Belfast and assumed active and highly effective leadership in the talks. On the last night, President Clinton stayed up all night in the White House talking to the prime ministers and to the party leaders. By the morning of Friday, April 10th, we had assembled the product of all of these efforts into a single document. 2 years earlier, at the beginning of the talks, I had told the delegates that if there was ever to be an agreement, it had to be theirs. No acceptable agreement could be imposed from above or from outside. As we distributed the final document to them that morning, I reminded them of that statement orally and in writing. I said to them, virtually every word in this document has been spoken or written by someone from Northern Ireland. This is your agreement. It is of necessity a compromise. It does not resolve every issue. There is much in it you will not like. There is much you will like. But this is the end. Now you must decide. And I asked each of them, please say yes. Each of the parties then went into caucus. Through the day, they debated the future of their homeland, of their constituents, of their families. Their questions and concerns were many and varied. The prime ministers tried to answer their questions, to reassure them, to encourage their approval. By the afternoon, the final calls started coming in, at first a trickle, then a rush, and then there was a lull as I waited for the last call. Shortly before 5, David Trimble called me. I will never forget his words. We're ready to do the business. The party leaders and the government officials gathered in the large conference room, already crowded with reporters, television crews, staff, many others. I had suggested an immediate vote to be followed by a discussion. Nobody objected or disagreed, but in the excitement of the moment, they just started talking, and they went on until everyone had their say. I realized that my suggestion was wishful thinking, and the discussion continued until they were ready to vote. That was fitting because it was their agreement. It still is, and it always will be, theirs and yours, so that history continues to open itself to hope. In the future, politicians will tell it one way, the poets will tell it another, and the history books still yet another. But it's likely that none of us will say it in precisely the way that our grandchildren and their children will understand it. What has led us here has not been perfect. What surrounds us now is not guaranteed. And what will lead us on is the ability to recognize the faults of the past and the dreams of the future. The agreement reached in 1998 did not resolve all of the outstanding issues. It was a political compromise, the best that could be achieved at that time. In the years since the agreement, there have been many chronicles describing those momentous events. Many individuals have been lauded for their efforts, and appropriately so. I believe it clear that the greatest heroes were the people of Northern Ireland and their political leaders. In the most difficult and dangerous of circumstances, those leaders acted with courage, with vision, and determination. At one time or another, all were criticized or rebuked. Some lost their public offices. Some of their political parties suffered huge declines. But most remarkable feats often suffer setbacks. I believe the verdict of history will be immensely favorable to the people of Ireland, North and South, and their leaders. Peace may come dropping slowly, but when it settles, it confirms the humanity in all of us. Triggered by this anniversary, there has been much discussion recently about the agreement. Of course, everyone is entitled to, indeed encouraged, to express their views. Some in and out of Northern Ireland have criticized the agreement because it did not solve every problem and because there continued to be in Northern Ireland some failure, disappointment, dispute, disagreement. But I respectfully disagree with these critics. I believe the statistics on deaths and injuries I cited earlier are by themselves a powerful response to such comments. Those who advocate such views are in effect holding Northern Ireland to an impossibly high standard that no other society could meet or does meet. What society doesn't have violence? What society doesn't have some criminals, including some masquerading as patriots? What society doesn't have disagreements, disputes, some disarray? And I say, as a visitor and a friend, Northern Ireland is a good place. The people are good people. They're energetic, they're hardworking, they're hospitable. They're trying to do what's right even as they disagree on its definition. They want peace. Going forward, Let's accentuate the positive in Northern Ireland. We need not eliminate the negative. Let's just keep it in perspective. My final words today are intensely personal. As many of you know, 3 years ago I was hospitalized with acute leukemia. To this day, I continue to receive treatment. As a result, my ability to function has been severely diminished. This is the first time in 3 years that I've attended and talked at a major public event. But Heather and I came here today because we want to say personally and directly to you and through you to all the people of Northern Ireland, from the bottom of our hearts, we thank you for your warmth, your hospitality, your generosity. We love Northern Ireland, the people and the place, and a very large part of our hearts and of our emotions will forever be with you. In approving the agreement by overwhelming majorities in a free and democratic election, the people of Northern Ireland and of Ireland showed others the possibility of hope. Within the word impossible is embedded the positive word possible. When you approved the agreement, you were also talking to Israelis and Palestinians, to Colombians, to Africans, to Asians, to Americans. In fact, you were talking to the world. This is an agreement for peace and for the future, not just here, but everywhere. We are living in fractured times. We need you. We need your ongoing patience, stamina, and perseverance. We need people who believe, who know that the possible does exist within the impossible. Don't let it slip away. May God grant you the opportunity and prosperity and everlasting peace you deserve. Thank you, Northern Ireland. From the bottom of my heart, thank you, Northern Ireland.
Whoa, follow that. Senator Mitchell, thank you so much for such a memorable address and for sharing your wisdom with us. I think we also probably just got some sense of your charm and your humour that must have helped a lot in those long, long negotiations. I'm sure you'll all agree that it has been an absolute privilege to be in the audience this morning and to hear the different perspectives from our speakers. But I think I speak for everybody here when I say how truly honoured we are that Senator Mitchell has been with us today. Senator, we will long remember and be grateful for your skill, your patience, your determination and your devotion. Can we have another round of applause just to say thank you to Senator Mitchell? Now, today's theme is reflect, and I'm sure that, like me, after listening to this morning's speakers, many of you have been thinking back about the last 24 years and just how much has changed in Northern Ireland. So now we've got the chance to hear some reflections from our first panel. It's called Building Bridges, the Two Governments. And in a few moments, I'll invite the panellists to join us on stage. They're led by our chair, Professor Mary McAleese, the former President of Ireland. And the Professor is joined by Paul Murphy, Lord Murphy, former Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, by Tim O'Connor, former Secretary-General to the President of Ireland, Liz O'Donnell, a former Minister of State and representative of the Irish government in those negotiations, and Jonathan Powell, the lead British negotiator on the agreement. So please join me in welcoming them all on stage.
Good morning. How are you? Oh, my Lord, is there anybody out there? Let me know you're alive and well. We have a fabulous audience. Welcome to my home city of Belfast. Welcome to Queen's, my alma mater. We're going to be joined, and are in fact joined on stage, by four people who indeed were referenced in that wonderful address by Senator Mitchell, who I think we can safely say taught the language of gracious politics to us over a very long time. He certainly showcased the value of respectful listening and avoiding the language of raw insult that just keeps people further apart. And what we're going to be looking at in this session is the relationship between the governments, the importance of the two governments, because while a lot of the focus, of course, has been naturally on the multi-party talks and how 25 years ago they were brought to a miraculous resolution, that wonderful compromise that we call the Good Friday Agreement, or the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. In fact, of course, in back of that, and sustaining it all these years, is an international treaty between the two governments, the Irish government and the British government. And so what we're going to look at are, first of all, let's just, because we're in a mood for reflecting, let's reflect with these experts who were right on the front line all the way through those difficult multi-party talks and those intergovernmental talks. Let's look at the role of the two governments. Many of us, of course, have lived long enough to see very considerable fluctuations in the, let's call it the temper of relations between the two governments. But there was something in the moment of the Good Friday Agreement, was there not, when things rhymed in a way that was very, very good for the peace process, for the development of the process. I'm going to start over here. We have two people who were junior ministers at that time, went on, of course, to very stellar careers, Lord Murphy, Paul, if you don't mind me calling you Paul, I think you don't, and Liz O'Donnell, my former student, also a junior minister on the Irish side, Paul on the British side. And then we have two people who were deeply connected to it. We have, representing the British side, Chief of Staff for Tony Blair, Jonathan Powell, whom I can safely say has maintained a huge interest in these issues ever since. And a man who became my own Secretary General in a later life, Tim O'Connor. So, Paul, I'm going to start with you. Would you bring us back to those days and tell us about the relationship between the Irish and British governments, and how important was it to the eventual success of the multi-party talks?
Well, thank you, Mary, and welcome everybody to a wonderful morning. I really have never witnessed anything quite like the last hour or so, and it's been so uplifting that I do hope, as incidentally, that will be a call for, as we will probably talk about later, some change here in Northern Ireland. But to answer your question, about 25 years ago, what was the position and the role of the two governments? Well, I was made the deputy to Mo Mowlam as Minister of State. I was technically the Minister for Political Development, but I was known as the Talks Minister, although listen to what George Mitchell just said, I was the listening minister for not quite as long as George, but almost 2 years. And the position in 97, later on, a few months by the summer, was that there were two new governments elected in that year. Obviously, the Labour Party under Tony Blair was elected in 97, and so was the Fianna Fáil government under Bertie Ahern some months later. So there was an opportunity for a new sweep. That doesn't mean to say that their predecessors, John Bruton and John Major, hadn't done a great job, because they had done. They had started off the process, and we sometimes forget when we are at events like this that it was those two men in their parties who started this off. But there was a change of atmosphere because of new governments and new prime ministers, and I think everybody thought that when we came into office in 97. What it also meant, of course, was that we, as very new ministers, had to get used to something totally alien to us. I'd been deputy to Mo in opposition, but being in opposition isn't the same as being in government. And it was a huge revelation, almost a shock, to be honest, to come to Northern Ireland as a relatively young, in my 40s, Welsh Member of Parliament, to see, even with Irish ancestry, to see what I had to face. And the fact that these two new governments were in this together, I think, made a big difference at that point. And, of course, we were served by outstanding civil servants and officials and advisors as well. And so there was a great feeling of hope. And the other thing I think I should mention, Mary, is that relations between the British and the Irish governments, which had never been easy over the years, were probably at their best when we came into office, the two governments, and that personal chemistry that existed between certainly the two prime ministers, but also between ministers like Liz and others, between the two governments, was absolutely essential. And as we'll discover over the next 2 or 3 days, and to remind ourselves that the two governments are joint guarantors of the Good Friday Agreement, so that an enormous role and significance in the talks itself, in no way underplaying the essential and overwhelming role that was played by the political parties in Northern Ireland as well.
Thanks very much, Paul. I'm going to turn, Liz, because you were the junior minister on the Irish side in the Department of Foreign Affairs. And I'm also very conscious that by the late 1990s, Ireland and the United Kingdom had been partners in Europe for the best part of a quarter century. And so, presumably, officials knew each other, politicians knew each other, were meeting regularly. Do you think to what extent had that impacted the ease of relationships between, for example, Tony Blair and Bertie Ahern and their officials?
Yeah, I think relations had been built up over previous years, but I do think that there was a moment when the two new, fresh Prime Ministers came into office with a priority, putting Northern Ireland as a priority on their governmental agenda. The two governments were ad idem, of one mind, and that was so central to the ongoing progress in the talks, because the two governments were in constant communication, Tony Blair's office, Taoiseach's office. And when we inherited the process, it was a moribund state, because the ceasefire had broken down in Canary Wharf. So, you know, there was no process to speak of. It was in a moribund state. But then on the 20th of July, I remember it because it's my birthday, the IRA reinstated the ceasefire. And so we were back in business. It was game on again. So that was really a time when everybody, you know, we were all daunted by the prospect of going in as new ministers. We all had to, you know, go back, study the documents that had been laid by the previous government, the Downing Street Declaration, the framework documents. I went off to Donegal and did my homework for the whole of August and came back fresh and ready to go in to the talks. And I think what you can see from just listening to George, I mean, is it any wonder we reached agreement with the leadership that he showed us, and he taught us so much as politicians how to listen to each other. Because what I always say, Northern Irish politicians of every hue, they were brilliant at articulating their own position, many of them fixed positions. But what happened in the talks is George encouraged them to listen to each other. And that listening process was hugely important. And I think from the British government's point of view, Mo Mowlam and Paul, for the first time, I think, really listened to the grievance which went to the heart of the conflict, the nationalist grievance, and listened and heard it for the first time. And that actually allowed us all to open up and shift from our own positions, because I had an abhorrence of paramilitary violence. Many people in the Republic had an abhorrence of it, and we had to engage in that. We all had to shift a bit in our positions to accept that there was going to be compromises, but we had the opportunity and the potential to bring an end to the vexed quarrel that had dogged us. At our happiest moments in the Republic of Ireland, the North was there, unfixed, broken, dysfunctional, people being murdered. So I think what the two governments had at that time was a feeling of urgency to stop the killing, a feeling of a huge responsibility to actually save Ireland from itself. And that's what drove us on, I mean, to end the killing. I know we had the political stuff to do. We had to put in place a whole new political set of institutions to move forward to replace the Anglo-Irish Agreement. But stopping the killing was the priority, and there was no greater motivation than that. And I think Mo Mowlam was a fantastic person to work with. I was Junior Minister, David Andrews, who's not here, unfortunately. But we had Bertie Ahern, who was fantastic as a leader, you know, unstinting in his commitment to this project of peace. And Mo always regretted and said, I wish it was more of a people's project. But in fact it was, because people had such an appetite for peace. There was a longing for peace, and that drove us on. And I think looking back, I'd say to the current generation of politicians to revisit that, you know, urgency that drove us on, to revisit that commitment and that collective purpose to find a solution to our difficulty. Look at the problems we overcame. Huge problems, the decommissioning of weapons, the remaking of Northern Ireland society, justice and policing. I mean, all of those things, the release of prisoners, they were all huge problems that we took and we solved by agreement, by reaching consensus, thanks to George. So I think the problems that are facing the current generation of politicians, they are all capable of being overcome. As George has said, you know, the possibility is there.
Can I ask Jonathan, because Liz has alluded to the huge amount of problems to be solved that faced the peace process way back at the beginning, but also then the realization that a team of actual human beings, there was no robot, there was no bot that was going to come up with the solutions. You were the people who in the background were going to have to do all the work of building relationships. How did you go about that?
Well, I think the first thing that was an important change from previous relations between two governments was you had two leaders from a new generation who didn't have the whole burden of history that their predecessors had had. I'd watched previous relationships between Taoiseachs and prime ministers, and there'd always been a bit of tension, even though they improved greatly when John Major came in. And then you had leaders who were prepared to take risks, who were really, Bertie with the Constitution in Ireland and Tony Blair more generally. And unless you have people who will take those risks and who will build those relationships you talk about, and you think about it, both Tony and Bertie spent a huge amount of time talking to the parties. George was talking about listening. I used to joke that if we ended a meeting after half an hour, we'd have got to 1689, and there'd still be 300 more years of grievance to get through before we got to the modern day. So you had to have that ability to listen. But then I think it's really important to remember you had two leaders who were in office for 10 years, which is unusual in our democracies, to have two people alongside each other for that long period of time. And when we celebrate the Good Friday Agreement, it's important to remember, too, that it took 9 years to actually implement the Good Friday Agreement, to get the institutions up and running in a sustainable way. And that was 9 years of negotiations, 9 years of political capital from two leaders. And that, I think, should be celebrated as well as the Good Friday Agreement itself.
So did that, thanks very much, Jonathan, did that good relationship at the leadership level, you as a civil servant working in the background, trying very hard to drive towards the day when all the institutions would be up and running. I mean, how important was it that you still had that open relationship between the two leaders at the top?
Absolutely. So first of all, thank you. I have to say, Iarúcht Aran, Chairperson, and I just wanted to say, privileged to be here today and to echo the congratulations to Chancellor Clinton and also Vice-Chancellor Greer and Richard English and Ryan Feeney. Pulling this together, it's such a difficult thing to have done. It would have been easier for Queen's just to do something nice and modest, but you've put something phenomenal together here. And as a civil servant, I would want to say also, W.C. Field said, you know, never perform with children and animals. But I can now add another one is, never go on stage after George Mitchell. So I'm an old guy. I'm a citizen as well, and I had the privilege of working with Mary Mackey. So for me today, being a civil servant here and trying to give the voice, and I hope I'm channeling all the other civil servants back for the 50 years, Sean Donlan and Michael Lillis and Sean Higgin, and sadly Dermot Gallagher, who was a key, who was passed away since, all of the people in the air. And I suppose, Chairperson, we were taking up the mantle of all of that. And I think what everybody has said here is absolutely true. By the time we reached 1997, say September, October 97, and as Liz is saying, everything was on. We were, though, building on a long sort of sequence of, including, I'd call it, theology and doctrine that had been built up over the previous. So I think in addition to and I have to pay tribute here to my old boss, Bertie Ahern, and to Tony Blair, frankly, I have to say to all of you, they were magnificent. And I know that politicians get a tough press, but I can only say as a civil servant observing, it was a privilege to do so. By the way, civil servants get a tough press as well. It's not easy for us now. Hal Roach, the Irish comedian, has a joke. He says, "I have 3 brothers, 2 still living, and 1 in the civil service." So, that's the kind of that's the backdrop we're coming. But we had our role to play as well, hopefully, in all this. And I just want to say just one word, Chairperson, on the doctrine of development. So back in 1969, 1970, when the Troubles broke out, frankly, British government regarded Northern Ireland as an internal affair of the United Kingdom. So even getting onto the pitch to be the two governments together was a journey, shall we say. I'm choosing my words carefully. I suppose it began, my old friends Pat Hines would say 1972 was probably, with the Green Paper, was probably the start of a recognition by the British government of an Irish dimension. And you could then, Sunningdale obviously 73, 74, then on to the Anglo-Irish Agreement 1985, and then in the later stages with the Downing Street Declaration of December 1993, and then, as John said, the framework document of February 1995. Those documents were all, if you like, the building up of theology or doctrine around how this was going to be a result. So when we were starting into what Paul and Liz have just been describing in the autumn of '97 under George's baton, we were starting from the huge amount of work that had been done, and then build on that, but do something that had never been done before. And so people say, what was different about the table for Good Friday? And I'd say what was different about it was that it was comprehensive. Sorry, it was inclusive in terms of the people around the table, so in terms of the wider representation of parties, and it was comprehensive in terms of the issues on the table. So those were the two new dimensions that were brought to bear, but building on all of the previous. And then, frankly, again, as a civil servant said, the leadership by the two Prime Ministers, Taoiseach and Prime Minister, and then, frankly, the leaderships, and there are a lot of them here today, of the political parties, because people had to. The easiest thing would be to say, to keep saying no. That's the safest thing to do. The status quo is king until the risk is taken to make the move. And I think Good Friday, aptly named in 1998, was indeed a magnificent day for the history, not just of the island of Ireland, but also the history of British-Irish relations.
Thanks a million. There was a lot of work, though, wasn't there? I mean, Jonathan has alluded to it, that we had the Good Friday Day and we had the May referenda, yes, which showed absolutely conclusively the huge yesness, the willingness for peace, the willingness for compromise that existed in the populations north and south of the border. But then you've outlined the huge amount of work that was already sitting on the desk, yes, done yes, in 1997. But now, 1998, Good Friday Agreement, and the two governments are the guarantors of what is now a very, very substantial process. Decommissioning, changing the policing. How did you go about that? How did the two governments go about sustaining that part, the actual process?
Well, we knew
Liz?
It was only a beginning. We knew, those of us who were close to it knew that there were so many things not tied down at the end, constructive ambiguities as that came to be known. But also we knew that it was going to take a long time to bed down the peace. And of course, we didn't have, realistic decommissioning for some years. And that then drained the confidence of the unionist community. And frankly, that drained the confidence of a lot of people about the success and the enduring nature of the peace. So, and remember, we had the disaster of Omagh only 4 months after the signing of the Good Friday Agreement, which broke all of our hearts. And we thought that we'd been sold a pup. We thought we were back to, the old ways again. So thankfully that wasn't the case, and it was a renewed commitment to actually make the peace work. And over the years, the various things, the big things happened. The reform of policing, which was massive, those had to be parked at the time, but they were very successfully done, and that was one aspect of the agreement that's been very successful. A whole new police service, which is representative of the community. And eventually we had the decommissioning of weapons. But the political stability, the institutions have only sat fitfully, and that's a source of great regret to those of us, because those of us who were there, and up to the late John Hume and Seamus Mallon, they were so excited about the notion of a power-sharing executive and assembly in Northern Ireland. That was really important to them. I remember John and Seamus coming in the middle of the night before the Good Friday Agreement, and they were tearful. They were so excited about, they'd done the deal, about how the new executive and assembly would work, because that presented the possibility of the people of Northern Ireland in all their diversity working together, for prosperity and peace. So it's a great pity that the institutions have not been stable, and I hope that in the course of, because of the new initiative now by the Windsor Agreement, which is sorting out some of the trade difficulties that have been, holding people back, that, there's a better relationship again. That relationship between the British and Irish governments is really important going forward, because we are, as Paul has said, we are the custodians. We have to protect it. Each generation has to protect the peace. You cannot just take it for granted. And, I think at the time, we knew it was only at the beginning, and so it has proved. And some people are at different stages of forgiveness and of willingness to move on, and you have to respect that. As George said, you have to be kind to each other and realise that people are not quite ready, and that ultimately, by consensus, the great promise of the Good Friday Agreement will be realised, and we will have functioning democracy and government in Northern Ireland as we agreed to have 25 years ago. And it's only through that stable democratic institutions that Northern Ireland will really prosper, will really get inward investment, will really begin to kind of live the dream of the Good Friday Agreement.
Maybe that's the part of the... I have a bit of a joke with George, which I said, George, I have it figured out. The Good Friday Agreement is the Irish agreement. First we signed it, then we negotiated it. There's a bit of a way in terms of what I was talking to Jonathan earlier. Part of understanding peace deals is actually that when you sign it, it's just beginning. Yeah. And to be honest with you, we didn't really understand that at the time.
But
we
thought
the
biggest 25 years.
Yes,
though,
exactly.
With an unstable state, strand one.
Yes. So implementation is. If I were asked what would you do differently, I would actually have more respect for the challenges of implementation. That it actually probably requires a scaffolding and a structure. Just Paul was just describing, and Liz was describing the kind of the very large infrastructure of negotiations that we had in place for the negotiations. But to be honest, once the institutions were up and running, everybody scattered and then went. Whereas in fact, probably looking back on it, actually implementation certainly is also a form of negotiation and probably requires, I don't know, Jonathan, what do you think there on that question?
I think what I've learned from the Good Friday Agreement and subsequent peace agreements I've worked on is that, perhaps not surprisingly, a piece of paper doesn't make two communities trust each other then they've been killing each other before. It's just a piece of paper. And it's only when that piece of paper is actually implemented, only when weapons are given up, only when power is actually shared. And that process of implementation is at least as important as negotiating the agreement, because that's what builds trust if people take those steps along the way. And if you don't take those steps, as with the Oslo Accords in the Middle East, you have an agreement, everyone celebrates, they go away and they don't implement it, it will collapse back into violence like the Second Intifada. And that could have happened here. And the key thing was, I think Tim's right, we should have thought more about it at the time, how to make that implementation work and how to make it a confidence-building measure in itself, because that's what builds trust between two communities that have been at war.
And then, of course, the big blow that came with Brexit.
Yes, it did. It was and is a blow.
Not taking any side here, obviously.
It was hugely significant. At the time, it was important, because one thing about these talks was that we were locked together. all of us, people I didn't know particularly well, but by the end of the 2 or 3 years, I knew them better than my family and friends, because we were literally living together for 2 to 3 years. And I often say to people that you can't make peace part-time. You've got to work at it in the way that we did here, with a structured process. But I do agree with the point about implementation. I think that we didn't look at that sufficiently well in the years that followed, although obviously we had to deal with the issues, but I don't think we had a structure quite like the one we had in the talks, which was dismantled, of course, when the talks were over, in order to see the implementation. But back to the question about Brexit. At the time, our joint membership, if you like, by which I mean the Irish and British joint membership of the European Union, was actually very important, to such an extent that Mo made me Minister for Europe, as well as Talks Minister. I didn't have much time for the second, but the Minister for the Europe meant it was so important that we were in this same club and that ministers and officials were meeting all the time in Brussels, in London, all over Europe, and discussing these issues outside Northern Ireland very often. Yet alone, of course, the issue of the peace money that came to Northern Ireland and the way by which that money was distributed meant it itself brought people together in a very special way. So when people say to me that our membership of the European Union had nothing to do with the peace process, I think it had a lot to do with it. But significantly, whatever one's views on Brexit, as soon as that happened, it was in a sense a torpedo coming into the talks now, the current talks, because of the fact that it's created a totally new constitutional situation in Ireland, north and south. The avoidance of borders was crucial when we decided to go for Brexit. But then we've had the issue of the border in the sea. And whatever way we look at it, and I think the Windsor Framework is a good attempt to try and deal with it, it does mean that there's a big problem here because of what happened over Brexit. And how we resolve that is probably crucial to how the future of this place is over the next number of months. But resolve it we must, because if we can't do that, then everything we've heard about this morning, not everything, but a lot of it, could be put at risk. And my job in the talks is to chair Strand 1, which, as you know, dealt with the Assembly and the Executive. And that's the one single strand, I think, which has suffered most over the last number of years, not just because of Brexit, because of other reasons as well. And I think we've got to think very carefully about how the future goes in terms of the way in which we have the rules which allow the Assembly to be suspended or not. Should we change the agreement in order to give some accommodation to a new regime, which would mean that you can still have your disagreements, but you can't bring down the whole Assembly and the whole Executive because of it? I don't know of any democracy in the world I know of no democracy in the world where you actually bring down the whole apparatus of government because you disagree on something. You know, what would happen where I come from in Wales if you brought down the Senate or the Welsh Government because of it? Now, I'm not underestimating the issues because people feel very strongly about them. Of course I do believe that's the case. But we've got to do something to restore. That's the sort of thing we didn't perhaps foresee. There were a number of things we didn't foresee.
Well, you didn't foresee Brexit.
No.
Because, let's face it, I mean, one of the great, if you like, supports, almost subtle and subterranean supports of the agreement and the process itself was common membership of the European Union.
And it was an assumption we all made.
And in particular, the single European market, which had, and the customs market, which had really absolved us from any need for border controls. You add to that the post-agreement demilitarization. There was a huge normalization of life on the island that was a visible peace dividend, but that was in a large part not just driven by the fantastic decisions in Strand 1 and the decisions of the multi-party talks, but also, of course, driven by membership of the European Union. Did you ever contemplate during the negotiations? Was Brexit ever within your contemplation?
I think we contemplated
never
everything
entered
else,
our minds.
but we never thought that would happen. It was completely unexpected and potentially disastrous for the project, because it reintroduced the notion of a border. And the whole success and part of the essential compromise of the agreement was that the border, that the status of Northern Ireland would remain as is for now, the principle of consent, and that there would be a border blurred by north-south bodies at the North-South Ministerial Council, the whole kind of, the whole interconnectedness of the three strands. And suddenly this was like a coach and four through that kind of pre-arranged agreement. So, like it or not, Brexit is here, and we have to accept the democratic wishes of the United Kingdom, and we have to manage that now. It's part of the continuum of the agreement, of the negotiations and the settlement and the political settlement going forward. But
do you think, though, are the Strand 2 arrangements, which were designed really to keep the two governments, especially the two governments, I think, in each other's orbit as guarantors, with institutions that would help develop that sensibility of two governments as stewards of the agreement? And do you think that has that stood up particularly with the experience we've had of Brexit and, well, not to put it overly delicately, the fact that we had, two prime ministers who really didn't assist, let's say, the development of good relationships between Ireland and Britain? I have to say, in fairness to Rishi Sunak, that seems to have been reversed mercifully.
I think John Major and Tony Blair both pointed out in 2016 that the problem Brexit would cause for Northern Ireland is that you would have to put a border somewhere. Yeah. It would either be on the island of Ireland, which would be disastrous for the Good Friday Agreement, or it could be in the Irish Sea, but you couldn't have no border. And Brexiteers argued you could do it by technology, which is interesting because there isn't anywhere in the world where you avoid a border with technology, and no one's managed to come up with that answer. Luckily, they didn't put the border on the island of Ireland, but then putting it in the Irish Sea, I don't think we should pretend that doesn't create problems for unionists, because it does create problems in terms of their identity. It's separating the United Kingdom from Northern Ireland and their perspective. So having done that, the British government had to find a solution that made that border as invisible as possible. And I think that's what they've tried to do with the Windsor framework, and I think it does the best job that can be done from that point of view. So I very much hope that the danger of Brexit is going to pass. I very much hope that the DUP is sensibly taking its time to think about this and consider how to make this work, that they will, later, after elections perhaps, look at this in a more positive light, because otherwise we're in a complete cul-de-sac as far as the political future of Northern Ireland is concerned. There is no way out, because we cannot reopen that agreement again with the EU. That is not possible. No Prime Minister, now or in the future, is going to do that. So the only alternative is to make the politics work. So I hope and believe, actually, that they will find a way to make this work. Maybe other things that have to be done, but it won't be reopening that. Their identity has been affected by what's happened, but we have to find a way to make the political future succeed. That was the point of the Good Friday Agreement.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that comes across, though, from this 25th commemorative period is just the enormous effort and time and energy that consumes governments and civil servants and politicians and people to try and drive this process. Can we be sure that continued momentum will be there as it faces these ongoing significant difficulties?
No, I don't think you can.
You can't.
But we've got to work for it. Can't be sure it's going to happen. But if we're going to learn the lesson of these 4 days, if the British government particularly is to learn the lesson, is that they've begun to take it seriously by the Windsor framework. And they've started, but that's only one side of the equation, is Europe. The other side, of course, is here in Northern Ireland. And I've said often in Parliament that you can't resolve these issues solely in Brussels. You have to resolve them in Belfast as well. And I think what now must happen is that hopefully the government can take a leaf out of our book, if you see, collectively here, and start a process of talks which could resolve the issues. After all, the Good Friday Agreement said you can review it. It was reviewed in 2007. It was reviewed on a couple of other occasions. We need, to be honest, a St. Andrews too, to try and resolve these things. But of course, you can't have an agreement unless you agree. So in other words, all the parties must agree to the way forward to avoid what trouble we're in at the moment. But I think we've got to do that seriously and firmly over the next number of months. I know it's difficult at the moment. There are elections, there's all sorts of things happening. But that doesn't mean to say you can't try. And I think, as I say, the big lesson of these 4 days is that if you work at it intensely and, above all, establish trust and confidence between people, you'll succeed.
Thanks, Paul. I mean, I suppose if you go back to, you're absolutely right in terms of the intensity of the issues that were faced. And I suppose if I could just put on the screen for a few minutes and also in front of the students and the next generation, one of the big issues, one of the core fundamental issues that we were facing in 97 is how are we going to handle the delicate issue, and I'm just going to have to say it, the constitutional status of Northern Ireland. An absolutely contested, a contested space, a contested question. And Bertie Ahern, as the leader of the Irish government side, and Tony Blair as leader on the British government side, the two fundamental historical philosophies were in play with each other. We had our Southern Constitution, 1937, Articles 2 and 3, with a territorial claim in Northern Ireland. I'm going somewhere now with this because that's the kind of the intensity of what was in play then. And we had to find a way, and here's what I want to say here. We found, and the key phrase is, a balanced accommodation. We found a balanced accommodation on all of those issues, which means that, sorry about this, but a single identity narrative on any side is not acceptable. And so I wanted to make the case for the semicolon. You're absolutely entitled as a party leader to put forward your position in a contested space, but you don't finish it with a full stop or an exclamation mark. You finish it with a semicolon to create the space for the other side. And that is the issue. So just as Paul is saying, those are the things we had to face at our time. Today, the challenge for the political leaders and at British and Irish government level and the parties is, what does the semicolon look like, in terms of trying to bring this together? And Jonathan is right in terms of this isn't, and I fully accept that from a unionist perspective, this isn't just about trade issues. That from their perspectives, there's constitutional issues in play here, and I respect that. But what I'm also saying, though, is the solution, though, cannot be a single identity one. It has to be the same principle that applied on Good Friday is we must come up with a balanced accommodation that takes account of all. And that's actually how we get this done.
Exactly, and I'm glad that our current Taoiseach has constantly said that the two aspirations, one for remaining with the Union with the United Kingdom and a political unity or a new dispensation of unity on the island, they're totally legitimate, equally legitimate aspirations. And we have to really state that constantly, that people have a right to their different allegiances. And they can be Irish or British or both. And regardless of whatever constitutional destination we reach ultimately, that there will be respect for everybody on the island. And that was the respect for the people and of a broken people that John Hume constantly spoke of. That was his dream for Ireland, that people of the divided people of Northern Ireland and the Republic and the United Kingdom could work together in harmony and peace. So I think the Shared Ireland initiative as well by the current government in the Republic is really good because it's a funded initiative which is helping to kind of get people working together on different initiatives, from research to biotechnology to the environment, and that's a funded initiative which actually blurs the allegiance issue and just gets people working together. But ideally it should be the North-South Ministerial Council, the implementation bodies continuing to work, because the Strand 2 was really important. The Strand 2 arrangements, which I chaired, meant that there was going to be a North-South Ministerial Council accountable to the Dáil and to the Assembly and the Government of Northern Ireland. But that hasn't been functioning because the other strands weren't working. But we do have, on strand 3, which is the British-Irish relationship, that holds out the possibility. There are clear, the Intergovernmental Conference and the British-Irish Council. Those are all institutions that we should be using more and regularly to actually help people, to get through and make progress slowly and make the peace endure. But there's one thing is certain, that we're never going back to political violence. We just have political problems now to sort out, not security. And we just have to manage that.
Isn't it the case, if I look at the strand 2 and the strand 3, and you have remarked that really they have, in some respects, there are some good aspects, but by and large, they haven't had the momentum or the dynamism or the heft that we might have wished for. No. But as that's been happening or not happening, the demographics of Northern Ireland are changing also quite dramatically. And that question is always still out there of the constitutional position of Northern Ireland, beautifully captured in the Good Friday Agreement in the sense that, as you've remarked, both sides of that binary argument have legitimate space. And indeed, the unionist argument essentially wins out because the agreement says Northern Ireland will remain part of the United Kingdom unless the people of Northern Ireland decide otherwise. Now, that second part is the issue now. Yeah. It's more, if you like, coming into frame more and more with changing demographics. This is not the Northern Ireland I grew up in, where you had an overwhelming Protestant unionist majority. That has changed very dramatically. So the question is, does the Good Friday Agreement, in both its aspects, both the multi-party element and also the two-government element, does it have the residual strength to face that changing, to face the consequences of that changing demographic?
Yeah, I think it has, yeah.
Well, I think it's important to remember what the Good Friday Agreement was and what it wasn't. The Good Friday Agreement was an agreement to disagree. It didn't settle this issue of the Constitution. What it did was remove violence so people could pursue different aims constitutionally, politically. And I think we should not try and make that more difficult for people to do. The danger of refusing to participate in the institutions, if 1 and 2 go, you're going to be left with just 3, and that's not going to be very acceptable going into the future. So we do need to find a way to make 1 and 2 work and to get the institutions up and running again. I think it's in the interest of everyone. And there is slightly paradoxical that it used to be unionists who wanted Stormont, and now we've got nationalists and Republicans demanding the return of Stormont and unionists resisting the return of Stormont. So something's changed in history. But we need to find a way of actually changing the Good Friday Agreement without putting it at risk. I think it would be a great mistake to change the system of power sharing in the middle of a crisis, just when power sharing has come actually to defend and be a protection to what is now a Protestant minority in Northern Ireland, having been there to protect the Catholic minority. So I think to change the rules halfway through the game would be unfair. But at some stage, if we can get the institutions up and running, power sharing and forced coalitions do not work well. Look at Bosnia and places like that. So we do need to find an alternative way of doing it, but it should be done by consensus.
Of course.
We've all just praised the Good Friday Agreement for inclusiveness, so we can't just change it with one side. It has to be all of the sides that change it together.
I entirely agree with that. I mean, you can't change the agreement unless everybody wants to change it. But Mary, I think you're absolutely right. 25 years is a generation change. And I think that younger people, obviously, people who weren't born, as we've seen this morning, when the Good Friday Agreement was made, have different views to those of us who were making that agreement all those years ago. It explains, for example, how the Alliance Party has changed in popularity in Northern Ireland over the last number of years. But you can't change the fundamentals of the agreement, but you can change some of the detail. And you mentioned Strand 3, which Liz and I jointly chaired in the talks, and how that strand was seriously being affected by Brexit, of course. It's meant that British-Irish relations over the last year or two have been rock bottom. Much improved since we've had this Windsor Agreement, but it does mean that much stronger bilateral arrangements between Ireland and the United Kingdom are now required. And the bodies that we set up, which haven't really been very effective, like the British-Irish Council and the Intergovernmental Conference, they have to be used properly now, so that we can ensure that the good relations which have now been restored continue, because that's crucial to it. And ultimately, of course, the point about the Constitution, it's the consent of the people of Northern Ireland. People here will decide what their constitutional future is. And we often forget how fundamental a change that was. You know, when we came into office in '97, the Labour Party changed our position in terms of a united Ireland. People can hold that view, of course, it's an entirely legitimate view to hold. But if you're going to be the honest broker, as we were supposed to be here in Northern Ireland, then you said it's not for us to decide, it's for you to decide what that's likely to be. And that remains the great basis of everything we do as a result of the Good Friday Agreement.
But one of the big problems, sticking with the Strand, we know the problems in Strand 1, we're living with them, but Strand 2 and Strand 3 were also meant to be strengtheners. These were meant to be, the warp and weft that would always hold when other things really, were in danger and difficulty. And what worries me, for example, just to give a small example, I remember during the Brexit campaign, being at an event in the Irish Embassy with Dan Mulhall, then Ambassador to the United Kingdom. And he made the point that day, that very day, as we were sitting pre-Brexit in the United Kingdom, in London, there were 25 meetings going on within this space that we call the European Union that involved British politicians, British civil servants, members of British civic society at the very highest level, across every panoply of things you can think of, building up those relationships on a daily basis. That fell away with Brexit. And because it fell away, we also now, in a sense, suffer from almost a kind of a poverty, is it not, of opportunity at least, for relationship building. How do we deal with that?
Could I just add just one point, though, after the Good Friday Agreement myself, I was sent by the Taoiseach, Bertie Ahern at the time, to be the first Joint Secretary of the North-South Ministerial Council. So I actually spent the next 5.5 years in Armagh, very happily, the campus that you actually set up, Chairperson, of Queen's, working with my Northern Ireland colleagues, some of who are here today, Tony McCusker and Rosalie Flanagan and others. And I was part of the building up of the first 5 or 6 years of the. So I do want to say one thing. While the North-South Ministerial Council, it's been stop-start, unfortunately, I do want to make a shout-out, though, for the cross-border bodies who are actually doing tremendous work. Tourism Ireland, Intred Ireland, Safe Food, especially EU Programmes Body, and so on, the Locks Agency. So there's actually, right now as we speak, like for instance, tourism has been transformed, and that's Tourism Ireland. So I think we need to just while at political level there's been the challenges out there in terms, so there's a huge amount of extras going on there. I think in terms of the British-Irish relationship, you're absolutely right. I know that under Taoiseach Varadkar and the Taoiseach Micheál Martin and Ruaidhrí Burke and the team in Foreign Affairs here are working very hard, I know now, on how do you backfill, what all of those interactions you're talking about. Obviously, the Strand 3 institutions have to be built up more. The Windsor Framework does allow, now for, new beginnings in that relationship, hopefully shared island, as Liz has just said. And of course, just also, you've been very strong on the, when you were president, you did amazing work on the whole people-to-people. There are 6 million Irish citizens living in Britain, 6 million, and the population of the Republic is 5 million. So there is a phenomenal basis there of the interpersonal relationship which is going to have to be built up. But and then one last point, I think that we haven't made this connection, but the connectivity between peace and prosperity is absolutely crucial. So it is not a coincidence that the last 25 years have also been the most prosperous, certainly I would say on the island as a whole. I know there's some debates between the economists about the economic dividend of the peace prosper Northern Ireland, but I would say that it's still been very, very, very strong and very powerful. So this connectivity between peace and prosperity, peace being the foundation, prosperity then on top of it, but then also reinforcing it. So that's been another great prize, I think, of the last 25 years.
We're going to be bringing this to a close in a few minutes, so I'll give you kind of a minute each just to summarise, because just to take up that last point, Tim, you know, I born and reared in Ardoyne, just up the road here, and when I was growing up, it had 70% unemployment. I think it still has 70% unemployment. And I think there are hard-to-reach communities here who probably, when they hear us talk about peace, dividend and prosperity, are saying, where?
Yeah.
And that is also down to governments. That's down to governments deciding to really use this peace dividend to penetrate deeply, deeply, deeply into historically excluded communities. If they were empowered, if they were raised, you know, to the best they can possibly be, I wonder, after 25 years of the Good Friday Agreement, you know, would things be still as difficult politically on the Strand one side? So maybe you just... Maybe you would just, in the final remarks, give hope to those people who are still saying, Good Friday Agreement, you know, what did it mean for me and my people?
I think there's enormous hope. If you compare the issues we had to deal with a quarter of a century ago, they were enormous compared with the problems we now face in Northern Ireland. And so, yes, hope is the essential word. And I think anybody who listened to George Mitchell's address this morning, in this hall or outside, can't but be inspired by what he said, is that, yes, he said at 5:30 on Good Friday 1998, this is only the beginning of a long haul, a long struggle. He was right, but it is a struggle that will end in success, I have no doubt at all.
I'm actually going to have to give the last word to my dear friend here on my left, because I've got a tyrant in front of me telling me you can't see this, and I've 1 minute left. So if you don't mind, Tim and Jonathan, you get the last word.
Prosperity is so important, and peace should go hand in hand with prosperity for Northern Ireland. And I know when I left politics, I worked for a multinational company, and I know what goes on in US boardrooms and the decisions they make about where they invest. And instability, political instability, and having no governance is a complete turn-off. So if the people of Northern Ireland want to actually really engage with the prosperities that's out there for the taking with inward investment, and President Biden has said this very clearly, we need to have the institutions up and running again. So the people of Northern Ireland have to have a government.
Well done, very well done.
Can I thank you for being an absolutely fantastic and very alive audience, and can I thank our 4 panellists whose knowledge is phenomenal and commitment.
Well, to Professor Mary McAleese and to all the panel, thank you so much. It was a really interesting and insightful discussion. Well, look, I think you are probably all in need of a bit of a break to reflect and to refuel on what we've heard today. Lunch is going to be served in a number of venues, and our volunteers will be there to direct you on hand. If you could stay in your seats for a moment while the speakers are taken away for lunch. And can I ask you to be back here at 1:15 sharp, please, for the next session? I also have to read out a notice from the PSNI, particularly for any drivers who have parked illegally on Elmwood Avenue. The PSNI have said, could you move your vehicles, please, or they might tow them away, and you would have to, that would be at the owner's expense. So that might be worth doing. And now if you can please make your way to the back of the hall, staff and volunteers will direct you to lunch.